Medieval knight is deeply ingrained in our consciousness. A noble warrior in shining armor, a symbol of honor, courage, and an entire era. We see him in novels, in historical films, and even in fairy tales. A figure encased in steel, mounted on a powerful horse, ready to fight for his lady or his lord. This image is so familiar and romanticized that it seems unshakable, as if carved from stone. We accept it without question, as a historical fact. But what if this beautiful picture is just a facade? A convenient screen hiding a series of inexplicable and disturbing anomalies? What if everything we think we know about knights isn't the whole truth, but only the part that's convenient to tell, without asking uncomfortable questions? We only need to look away from the heroic epics for a moment and examine the hard facts, and the familiar world begins to fall apart. It seems that some historians, like guardians of ancient lore, prefer to ignore the inconsistencies sticking out from every angle, so as not to disturb the established narrative. They are prepared to dismiss obvious technological elements as beautiful but useless, and logical fallacies as quirks of the era. When the facts contradict the theory, it's easier to declare the facts as strange than to reconsider the theory. But what if these strange facts are the very key to the mystery? What if the armor wasn't just a protective shell for a man, but something entirely different? And this is precisely why official history has reached a dead end. Let's ask the main question. Was the person we imagine even inside that armor at all? This very question begins a journey into a labyrinth of riddles, where each new fact fails to provide an answer, instead creating even more doubt. As we dive into chronicles and documents, we encounter rules and customs that seem not just strange, but completely illogical from the perspective of human psychology and military tactics. We are told of wars where the rules were so absurd they make you question the sanity of the participants. Imagine an army that was completely and physically annihilated if it lost a single warrior, the knight. This wasn't just an incentive to protect him, it was a system where the value of one figure was immeasurably greater than thousands of other lives. This custom is well documented, yet it has no coherent explanation. Why was the life of an entire army directly dependent on one combatant, as if he were not a commander, but something like a heart, whose stopping would cause the entire body to perish? This value system, where one figure is worth more than thousands, is further reflected in even stranger rules of engagement. Picture this. A common soldier, a footman, finds himself near an enemy knight in the heat of battle. Perhaps he could deliver a decisive blow or help his own commander. But no. Any physical contact with a knight by a common soldier was punished with immediate termination. It didn't matter if his intentions were hostile or friendly. Only another knight could capture a knight. This rule seems like the height of aristocratic snobbery, until you consider its deeper implications. Historians explain it as an effort to keep a noble captive alive for ransom. But this logic doesn't hold up. In a real battle, where the fates of armies are decided, no one would risk victory to observe such a fragile piece of etiquette. A valuable prisoner would be captured by any means, and by any forces necessary. However, if we assume that a knight was not just a man in armor, but something else, then the rule, "only a knight may touch a knight," takes on a sinister yet logical meaning. It's no longer a matter of honor, but rather a technical protocol. It's as if only the operator of a similar suit knew how to correctly interact with the opponent, how to disable or control him, without causing irreversible damage or triggering some kind of defensive reaction. This transforms the duel from a battle between two warriors into a confrontation between two systems, where interference from an outside element was forbidden and perhaps dangerous for everyone. This picture of complete absurdity is completed by accounts of battles that can hardly be called battles at all. Chronicles mention engagements where knights fought in duels that lasted for several days, while their armies of thousands simply stood aside and watched. They didn't join the fight, didn't try to help their leader, didn't make any tactical maneuvers. They were spectators in this theater of war, where only the main actors in iron masks performed on stage. And only when one of the knights admitted defeat did something astounding happen. His army wasn't scattered or destroyed, but instead transferred its allegiance to the victor. And most importantly, this happened with the consent of the defeated knight. It looks less like the result of a bloody battle, and more like the transfer of an asset. It's as if the army was not a collection of living people, but a resource that changed hands along with the surrender of its controller. Later, this strange role of the knight as the central element of the army would be transformed. He would be replaced by a banner, a flag with a face, and, as some sources indicate, even a light bulb on the pole. The loss of this symbol, like the loss of the knight, would be equivalent to the complete defeat of the unit, albeit with less fatal consequences for the personnel. But the very replacement of a seemingly living commander with an inanimate object only emphasizes that his function was primarily symbolic and managerial, rather than human. These strange, illogical laws of war paint a picture of the knight not as a person, but as a unique figure, the center of a system governed by entirely different, non-human rules. If their existence on the battlefield was so regulated and isolated from ordinary people, then what can be said about their daily lives? After all, if they fought so strangely, how did they live? Especially during long military campaigns, locked inside their metal shells for weeks on end. Moving from the oddities of the battlefield to the realities of life on the march, we encounter mysteries that are even more frightening, because they concern the very basics of biological survival. Historical accounts claim that knights might not remove their armor for weeks at a time while on campaign or under siege. This fact, often presented as an example of incredible endurance, becomes an unsolvable problem with the slightest thought. Let's imagine for a moment a person completely sealed inside a metal shell. The very first question that arises is one of basic physiology. How did a person trapped in such confinement relieve themselves? The answer found in some chronicles is simple and, at the same time, monstrous. Right there, inside the armor. This detail instantly shatters the entire romantic image. But the issue isn't aesthetics, it's basic biology. Under the steel plates, a knight wore a padded garment, a gambeson, or aketon. Any person forced to exist under such conditions would turn their armor into a hermetically sealed container of waste. Constant contact with bodily fluids would inevitably lead to severe skin diseases, rashes, ulcers, and eventually, blood poisoning. But that's not all. Digging through the archives, historians discovered information about an even more shocking hygiene practice. To somehow cope with the consequences of such an existence, the knight, it is claimed, was periodically rinsed out. Water was poured inside the armor through the raised visor or neck joint, several times a day. Some helmets, if you look closely at their design, seem to be made specifically for this. They resemble a funnel where the eye slit faces upward from the inside, convenient for pouring liquid in. Now, let's put all the pieces of this puzzle together. A person is in a closed metal space. He's wearing a thick, padded undergarment that is now constantly wet. This wet cloth is pressed against a body soaked in its own filth. Under these conditions, even without engaging in combat, the human body would face catastrophic consequences. The constant dampness would lead to hypothermia, even in warm weather. The skin, deprived of air and in an aggressive environment, would begin to rot alive. Any scratch or chafe would instantly become a source of infection. How many days of such a life would it take for a person to simply perish from sepsis or pneumonia, sitting inside this wet, decaying cocoon? Weeks? More like days, if not hours. To this, we add another legend, often taken as a metaphor for endurance. The knight slept standing up. What incredible willpower and dedication to duty would be required to endure all the aforementioned torments and also deprive oneself of proper rest? Human physiology demands muscle relaxation and a horizontal position to recover strength and maintain normal circulation. Constantly being in an upright position, especially in heavy armor, would lead to swelling, vascular problems, and complete nervous system exhaustion. Endurance and willpower can accomplish much, but they cannot override the laws of biology. The combination of these factors, the unsanitary conditions, the constant moisture, the lack of proper sleep, creates a picture in which human survival seems absolutely impossible. This is not just discomfort, this is a slow and agonizing demise. Official history awkwardly tries to explain these moments, attributing everything to the harshness of the era and the fantastic fortitude of medieval warriors. We're told about slaves who hauled stones for the pyramids, so why not believe in a knight who lived for weeks in wet armor? But what if the issue isn't phenomenal human endurance, but that we are starting from a false premise? What if this entire system was not designed for a fragile human body? What if the armor itself, its very design, was the key to survival in these unthinkable conditions? Let's stop looking at the knight as a person and start looking at his armor as engineers. Perhaps the answers to all these questions are hidden in the metal itself, in its shape and construction. When we begin to study surviving suits of knightly armor, not as museum exhibits, but as functional mechanisms, the number of questions only grows. Instead of perfect protection tailored to a warrior's anatomy, we see numerous design choices that seem not just inconvenient, but frankly, incompatible with the human body. These engineering flaws appear so frequently that they are hard to dismiss as the inexperience of a particular craftsman. They seem to be a systemic feature, as if this armor was created from a template that didn't quite match human anthropometry. Let's start with the most important thing for any combatant: vision. A helmet must protect the head while allowing the wearer to see the enemy. However, on many medieval helmets, the eye slits are placed in extremely odd positions. If you mentally place an average person's head inside, their eyes would be either significantly above or below these slits. To see anything, the warrior would have to constantly hold his head in an unnaturally tilted up or down position. Fighting under these conditions, tracking an enemy's rapid movements while maintaining your own balance is a nearly impossible task. It's like trying to drive a car while looking at the road through a narrow mail slot. One gets the feeling that a warrior in such a helmet had to navigate not so much by sight as by instruments, as if receiving information in some other way. No fewer questions are raised by the mobility of the limbs. The foundation of any swordsmanship is freedom of arm movement. But the design of some plate pauldrons, the shoulder armor, completely contradicts this principle. The shoulder plates are rigidly fixed to the cuirass, without the necessary degrees of freedom. Such a stiff connection makes a full lunge or swing almost impossible. The arm simply cannot extend forward for a thrusting attack. The movements of a warrior in such armor would be stiff and limited, which in a real battle is equivalent to suicide. The combat system built around such armor must have been completely different, unlike the fencing we are familiar with. But the most astonishing mystery is hidden in the design of the leg protection. Many early examples of greaves, which cover the shins, are a single metal tube that follows the shape of the calf muscle and seamlessly transitions into the foot protection. They lack a heel as such, and the boot part curves directly into the foot. Most importantly, these greaves have no doors, hinges, or joints. They are a single, solid piece. Now, let's imagine a simple task. How does a person get their foot, with its L-shaped ankle, through a narrow, solid tube? It's physically impossible. To put on such a piece of armor, one would either need to be able to detach their own foot, possess incredibly thin and flexible legs capable of bending at an unbelievable angle, or the armor itself would have to be several sizes too large, which would negate its entire protective function. Interestingly, later suits of armor were equipped with special doors on the shin guards, which were closed with laces or primitive clasps. It seems like a solution to the problem. But the very fact that it wasn't there initially, and that the fastenings for these doors were extremely flimsy, suggests that this was merely a later attempt to adapt an alien technology for human use. And finally, the head. Much like the one-piece greaves, early helmets also lacked an opening visor. To put on such a helmet, the head had to be pushed up from below, through the neck opening. But here's the problem. This opening was often too narrow. Metal is not a sweater or a pair of jeans. It doesn't stretch. Trying to push a human head, with its maximum width at the ears, through a narrow metal ring is like trying to shove your fist into the neck of a bottle. It simply won't work. All these design oddities, the placement of the eye slits, the stiffness of the shoulders, the solid greaves, and the narrow neck openings, form a single picture. It's as if this armor was not intended for a human. It's as if it was created for a being with a different anatomy, with a different eye placement, different joint biomechanics, perhaps with thinner and more flexible limbs, or even a different skull shape. These engineering flaws are too systematic to be a coincidence. They force us to look at the armor from a completely different angle. Especially strange in this context are the helmets themselves. They are not just faceless protection. Many of them are crafted in the form of grotesque, frightening masks. They look like faces. Terrifying, inhuman faces. As we examine the helmets of medieval knights, we enter a territory where rational explanations begin to fail. If the primary function of armor is protection, then many helmets simply do not follow this logic. Instead of smooth, streamlined shapes, perfectly designed to deflect blows, we often see true works of art. Frightening, grotesque, and completely non-functional from a military standpoint. These are not just helmets. They are metal faces, frozen in hideous grimaces, with hypertrophied features, bestial snarls, and empty, inhuman eye sockets. Official history explains this as an attempt to intimidate the enemy. But in a real battle, where life is on the line, a warrior would sooner choose reliable and comfortable protection over a decorative element, no matter how frightening. Furthermore, the complex shapes, numerous protrusions, and detailed reliefs of such a helmet would become a perfect trap for an enemy's blade, increasing the chance of penetration rather than reducing it. A horizontal slit for a mouth on some examples. What purpose did it serve in combat? To spit insults? Or something else? These helmets look less like a means of protecting a human face, and more like a replacement for one. A heretical thought arises. What if these metal masks were not imitating a face, but were the face? What if they were an integral part of the creature inside? Its true, unchangeable physiognomy. This hypothesis is supported by other strange design elements. On many helmets, near the ear area, one can notice peculiar corrugated plates, resembling small metal dishes or shells. Historians call them mock ears, a decorative element. But why create such a complex and vulnerable detail just for decoration? From an engineering perspective, such a corrugated structure is perfectly suited for capturing and amplifying sound waves. It is strikingly similar to the diaphragm of a speaker or a primitive hearing aid. Perhaps this was not a decoration, but a vital sensory organ, allowing the being inside the armor to navigate, picking up sounds that a human ear, muffled by layers of metal and cloth, could not perceive. And such elements were found not only on helmets. In addition to the strange acoustics, some helmets also had a peculiar hydraulic system. As mentioned earlier, their construction often resembled a funnel, as if they were specially adapted for something to be poured into them from above. In the context of rinsing the knight with water, this seems like part of a monstrous daily routine. But if we look at it more broadly, such a design could have served to deliver some kind of nutrient mixture or cooling fluid, necessary to sustain the life of the organism enclosed within this metal cocoon. This transforms the helmet from a simple piece of protective headgear into a complex interface, connecting its wearer to the outside world, through visual slits, acoustic membranes, and a port for refueling. Thus, the helmet ceases to be just a mask. It becomes the central element of the system, its head in both a literal and figurative sense. Its frightening appearance is not an attempt to scare a human enemy, but possibly the true likeness of its owner, a reflection of its inhuman nature. These grotesque faces, frozen in metal, stare at us across the centuries, and their silence is more terrifying than any scream. They are the missing piece of the puzzle, which is beginning to form a single, disturbing picture. So, we see a set of illogical military rules, seemingly not made for humans. We face living conditions inside the armor that are absolutely lethal for a person. We discover that the design of the armor itself contradicts human anatomy. And finally, we look into the face of this mystery, the frightening, inhuman masks of the helmets. Each of these threads, taken separately, seems like just a historical curiosity, but when woven together, they form a pattern that has no place for the familiar image of the knight. If we put all these pieces of the puzzle together, what image emerges? The legends and ancient engravings, once considered mere artistic fantasy, give us the last, most terrifying clue. Now that all the pieces of the puzzle are before us, it is time to assemble them. The strange rules of combat, the unbearable living conditions, the inhuman design of the armor and its terrifying visages, they all point in one direction. But the final and most crucial element that holds the entire structure together comes from ancient legends and images, which official history has long dismissed as mere folklore and artistic exaggeration. What if they were not metaphors, but documentary evidence? In many cultures, there are tales of warriors who continue to fight even after being decapitated. We usually interpret this as a symbol of incredible bravery and will to win. But what if this description should be taken literally? Legends tell us explicitly that a headless knight could remain in battle for some time. This image finds its gruesome confirmation in old engravings. We see scenes where a knight is struck a blow that severs his head along with the helmet, but this does not lead to an immediate fall. Moreover, the opponent's actions afterward appear extremely strange. Instead of simply acknowledging victory, he begins to perform manipulations that can hardly be called a finishing blow in the usual sense. In some depictions, we see the victor, instead of striking the body, attempting to thrust his sword into the neck opening of the defeated armor. His actions are less like trying to kill a person and more like an attempt to scoop out or damage something inside. It's similar to how one might gut a crab or try to shuck an oyster. It's a technical process, not an act of violence against a living being. Historians explain this as a symbolic act or an attempt to remove the expensive armor. But in the heat of battle, such actions seem absurd. It's far more logical to assume that the removal of the head and helmet was not fatal. It merely disabled the main control or sensory module, but the system inside the armor continued to function. And to finally shut it down, it was necessary to damage the internal mechanisms through the only available opening. All these facts, from the illogical laws of war to the literal interpretation of legends, lead us to a single, shocking hypothesis that explains absolutely all the oddities. The knight's suit of armor was not armor as we understand it. It was something much more. It was an exoskeleton. A complex biomechanical system, possibly autonomous or semi-autonomous, that served either as an external shell and life support system for some biological creature, or was its body itself. Within this theory, everything falls into place. The inhuman living conditions? They were normal for a creature whose physiology differed from ours. The rinsing with water could have been part of a cooling or feeding system. The inability to relieve oneself in a human way was not a problem if the organism's metabolism was different, or the system had built-in waste disposal functions. The inconvenient design of the armor? It was perfectly tailored to the anatomy of its true owner, not a human. The stiff shoulders and solid greaves were not a hindrance if the biomechanics of its limbs were different. The strange helmets with terrifying faces? They were not masks, but the actual heads of these beings, equipped with sensors. And most importantly, this theory explains the strange laws of war. The rule, "Only a knight may capture a knight," was not a matter of honor, but a technical necessity. Only the operator of a similar system knew how to interact with it. The annihilation of an entire army after the loss of its knight was the shutdown of the control center, after which its subordinate units, possibly humans, became useless. And the legends of headless warriors ceased to be a metaphor. If the head with the helmet was just one module, albeit an important one, its loss did not mean the immediate shutdown of the entire system. Thus, we arrive at the conclusion that beneath the guise of medieval knights, a non-human or post-human civilization may have been hiding, using complex exoskeletons to exist in our world. The people who surrounded them, squires, soldiers, were more like maintenance staff or subordinate units than equal comrades in arms. If this theory is correct, then we are faced with new, even more global questions. Where did these beings disappear? What happened to their technology? Why were they replaced by humans who clumsily copied their armor, turning functional elements into decoration? And why does official history so diligently sidestep all these facts, preferring to tell convenient tales of noble warriors, instead of admitting that there is a vast, terrifying, and completely unexplored chapter in the pages of our past? This shocking theory, like a key, unlocks a door to a completely different version of the past, leaving us alone with even deeper and more troubling questions. If the classic knights in their solid armor were not human, but representatives of another civilization, then the entire subsequent history of knighthood is cast in a new light. What do we see as we approach the Renaissance? The armor begins to change. The doors on the greaves appear, fastened with straps and laces. Neck openings become wider, and helmets are fitted with complex visor systems, allowing a person to easily put them on and take them off. The quality of craftsmanship, despite the external complexity, paradoxically declines. The seamless, precisely forged early suits of armor are replaced by cruder, composite constructions. Is this not proof that humans, left without their masters, were simply trying to copy their technology without fully understanding its purpose? They saw the external form, a metal suit, and tried to recreate it, adapting it to their own human anatomy. Where there was once a solid piece, perfectly suited for a non-human limb, they now had to make a cut and invent lacing. Where there was a complex sensory helmet head, there was now just a metal pot with slits for eyes. Functional elements whose meaning was lost were turned into useless beauty, into decorative flourishes and coats of arms. The era of the Iron Phantoms was replaced by an era of human imitation. Knighthood transformed from a phenomenon into a social institution, and the exoskeleton into ordinary armor. And then the question of legacy arises. Today, museums and armories around the world hold a colossal amount of medieval weaponry. According to some estimates, we are talking about tens of thousands of artifacts, about 3,840 cuirasses, helmets, and shields, over 2,400 bladed weapons, more than 5,000 polearms, and thousands of firearms. We are told that this is weaponry intended for soldiers of the 15th to 17th centuries. But what if a significant portion of this arsenal, especially the earliest and most perfect examples, is not just weaponry? What if these are the remains, the artifacts of an entire civilization we have overlooked? these are not just pieces of metal. These are the skeletons, the shells of those who once walked this earth, fought on its battlefields, and commanded its armies. We look at them in museums, admiring the skill of the blacksmiths, but perhaps we are looking at the remains of the blacksmiths themselves, at their true form. All of this forces us to return to the very beginning and ask the main question. Why does this version of history seem so incredible? Perhaps because official science prefers to ignore what does not fit into the familiar worldview. It is easier to label an obvious design feature a ritual decoration than to admit we do not understand its purpose. It is easier to dismiss illogical historical facts as the quaint customs of a harsh era than to allow for the possibility that these customs were not human. This position is convenient. It does not require revising thousands of dissertations and textbooks. It allows us to remain the sole intelligent masters of our planet and our history. But the facts are stubborn. They lie in museum display cases. They look out at us from the pages of ancient manuscripts. They cry out that our past may be far more complex, strange, and frightening than we are used to thinking. We have been offered a beautiful and simple fairy tale about knights, but perhaps it is time to grow up and start asking uncomfortable questions. To look at armor not as a costume, but as a machine. To read legends not as fiction, but as coded testimony. To seek answers not in ready-made explanations, but in those very anomalies that are so diligently ignored. Because perhaps it is within them, in these inconsistencies and illogicalities, that the key to understanding who, or what, the Iron Knights of the Middle Ages truly were, is hidden. History has not yet been fully written, and its most incredible chapters may still be waiting to be read.